Okay, welcome back. We've had a bit of a change in our setup. We have
Very professional.
professional. We have a professional camera setup. We have a cameraman. Previously, we used my mobile phone on a tripod, and now we have AJ, our cameraman. He's off to the side. So we have dynamic cameras. So we'll see. You'll see zoom ups of our face at some point today. To put my makeup on.
I haven't got much makeup on today.
So this is episode 10.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to make sure I get that right because I think when I was recording with Ravi, I think I told him it was episode 10 that we were doing then. It wasn't, it was episode 8.
I'm pretty sure when I recorded with my brother, I couldn't remember the episode at all and had to apologise at the start of the episode because I thought you'd tell me off.
No, I might have cut it out too. I cut out telling Ravi what episode it was because I was like, oh my god, I had a look and we were an episode behind. But we also changed the order of the episode with your brother and with Ravi. So episode 10 we're on now, and we thought that it would be timely to talk about a big problem that's in the media at the moment. So this comes from one of our colleagues suggested this, and she was going to join us, but she's not in today. She's not in this week, so she was like, record it without me. But Channel 4 have gotten themselves in a bit of trouble for an ADHD documentary, and we thought we'd talk about ADHD.
Yeah. And I'm really upset because I think growing up, Channel 4 was always my go-to. So Channel 4 was always, I think, I don't know if you agree, like the more progressive channel. So it was sort of a channel that kind of championed diversity. It sort of did kind of approach the more difficult topics, but always kind of from that sort of standpoint of kind of like inclusion and just generally almost like a bit more kind of a liberal way of looking at things. But I feel like this has completely like hit the wrong tone.
This fits very neatly within this like modern day anti-scientific rhetoric that's going around quite a lot. I mean, there is a part of me that appreciates part of the underlying discussion of the ADHD Myth show that they had, which is this idea of like social constructs. And part of me appreciates that's things being a social construct does feel very like liberal and in terms of its approach, but I think it's quite poorly placed. It's misplaced, and so we've both watched it. And I don't know about you, but it ruined my night. I watched it and I was furious afterwards. And I had my notes and I wrote these. I was literally watching it, pausing it, writing down notes, watching it, pausing it, writing down my notes. I don't know what your thoughts were.
Yeah, so similar. So I didn't write notes, although I did say before I watched it that I was going to go find a pen and paper to write notes. But we watched it, me and my partner, and I was the one that kept pausing it to basically explain why it was wrong to him. And I think by the end of it, he was just like, "Can you just watch the show?" I was just like, "No, we need to rewind. I need to see exactly what they said there and kind of go back over it." So yeah, I wouldn't say it ruined my night, but it really frustrated me. But also, I think one of the things that worried me about it, and I know we'll get onto this, is that I think I also kind of came away saying that I didn't disagree with a lot of what was being said, and that this needs to be completely in context because I do disagree with the overall conclusion and the overall message. But what was actually being said individually by a lot of the academics, a lot of the practitioners, I think wasn't incorrect. They've just taken it out of context and they spun it in a way that I don't think was ever actually intended.
Yeah.
And since then, and you highlighted this point, and I think we also, because again, when I was watching it with my partner, we were doing little bits of research as we were watching it. Quite a few of those that have contributed to the show as academics and as kind of like professionals in the experts in the area have now withdrawn their support for what was said simply because what they said was used in not the correct context. Basically.
Yeah, I think so. One of the ladies that appeared quite significantly in it, I know that she's recently been in the news for saying that she recorded for like an hour and she'd given this whole argument about why ADHD is a thing and also why there's arguments why it isn't a thing. and then Channel 4 just cut out the first part of that and just use the why it isn't. I think that's part of the larger issue, is that in like science and academia, a lot of arguments are there are multiple perspectives, and it's all about there's never. I do this with student feedback when they say this evidence proves this, and I always go, you can't prove anything because like implies that it's 100% certain, and science never has 100% certainty. I always use the example of like gravity. Like, do you think gravity is 100% certain? Everybody goes, yeah, everybody knows about gravity. You go, okay, but gravity stops making sense when you get to like black hole level physics, macro physics, and like quantum physics. Gravity just doesn't work. And so we've got these theories that we assume are like so true, but they're actually not. And that's something that's always worth keeping in mind when it comes to these debates. But look, like you said, is this they've taken a part of that argument and spun it in a specific way as though it was certain, and it very much came across almost like conspiracy theory esque, of like these like people there's this system, they want to drug everybody. And again, like you said, I agreed with some of the arguments, some of it around with the case study, the child, and we're going to take him off of sugar, we're going to get rid of all the sugar. I do have research that disputes that and says actually the way that sugar interacts with ADHD is absolutely not what they're saying, and that interaction is very specifically evidence of ADHD being a thing. But like, removing the video games, these are things that on like TV, things that I'm like, oh yeah, absolutely, these are things that we should be doing more anyway. But this argument of ADHD isn't real, it's just kids eating too much sugar and playing too many video games, was like, it was almost insulting, because it was such a like an oversimplification of an incredibly complex interaction of multiple different things. So I noticed early on that they were talking about drugs quite a lot. A lot of the discussion of ADHD was the drugs, and I've written down here they've described the amphetamines as though they're going, like, one of the big things where they went, yeah, they give them amphetamines. That's cocaine. Cocaine's an amphetamine. They're giving children cocaine, and we're being like, oh, like, yes, but also that's such an over exaggeration of what that actually means. So, cocaine features in quite a lot of things, surprisingly. Sigmund Freud was a pioneer of cocaine for medical purposes. He also liked to take it for psychoactive purposes, but one of his big things was around using cocaine for eye surgery, because it numbs the eye and it dilates the pupil or constricts the pupil, and so that you can do eye surgery safer. And all of a sudden you go, oh, but it's cocaine. It's like, yeah, but it's medically controlled cocaine, in the same way that morphine is also the same component as heroin, and that's why people take it. And like, God forbid, the secret ingredient in Coca-Cola
Yeah.
was ADHD medication. Obviously not anymore, but it's this whole like so like emotionally over dramatizing stuff. This medication is cocaine. It's like, yeah, but also lithium is an antidepressant, and like so many drugs that we give for all sorts of, even what's the paracetamol, ibuprofen, what do these do to the body? And nobody's batting an eyelid because it's 25p from the local home bargains. But all of a sudden, when it's ADHD and it's mental health, it suddenly becomes this whole different issue. And it definitely feels like this big double standard of when it's mental health and you can't physically see it, it's all of a sudden diminished. And I don't know if you picked up on the way that they talked about the neuropsychology behind ADHD was also really, again, for me personally, really irritating, the way that they kept saying something and then doubling back on it almost.
Yeah, so I mean, the neuro, obviously, so my area is kind of like child dev stuff, and we do kind of like teach all sort of different kind of perspectives when thinking about ADHD. I do know at one point, and again, this was in relation to the academic who actually withdrew her support, they basically concluded that there was no structural differences or differences in terms of sort of like connectivity or activation between typical brains and brains of children, that may have ADHD, but her entire body of research basically looks at the neurological profiles of children with ADHD and has a very strong conclusion that there are fundamentally physical differences. So that's the bit that I mainly remember them talking about. But no, so was there a bit where they kind of went back and forth on it?
Yeah, so they claim that there's no evidence that ADHD is physical in the brain, but then immediately followed this up by going, oh, and here's some evidence that suggests that there are differences in the brain, but they're only quite small.
Yeah.
So it's this idea of they dismissed the evidence and then went, but there is evidence, but it's only very small evidence. And it's this like moving of the goalposts that was quite irritating. And I do recognise, and again, this is where they would keep saying stuff that you go, yeah, true, and then they continue to go, okay, now you've lost it. Where they were talking about, well, okay, there's no physical neurological thing that you can point at. There's just neural correlates, and these are just correlations. And we go, well, yes, but anything that you do that's like medically invasive with like the brain, for the most part, unless you're cracking somebody's skull open, if you're using a CAT scan, if you're using an MRI scan, and so on, it's always a correlate, but we still treat it as medical data. It's still that if somebody's starting to go blind and you put them in an MRI scanner and you see that they've got a tumor in their brain, you're going to go, visual impairment, tumor, they're probably causing each other. It's actually only technically a correlation. You can't prove it, but that's never been an issue in the medical field. And so this is where, again, like this idea of this moving goalpost starts to get really frustrating, that they'll review some evidence, they'll dismiss it, or they'll start to go, oh, well, actually it's there, but it's not big enough, it's not what we like. But it also then starts to stretch further. Let's talk about a disorder that nobody is going to argue about, it being renal, schizophrenia. Where is schizophrenia in the brain?
Is that a question?
Well, it's an open question. It's a hot quiz. Where is it in the brain?
The frontal lobes are implicated, right?
Yeah.
But so is the...
Yeah.
Is the answer that it's several different areas and the profile completely changes depending on the person?
Just like in ADHD. Mm-hmm. The source thing is the same argument around ADHD, which is there isn't a place in the brain, and it's never. I think part of this problem comes from this issue of being able to establish that clear differentiation between medical and psychological, neurological conditions, where you can point at somebody's kidneys and go, there is something physically wrong and we can see it. And when it comes to somebody's brain, we can still, for the most part, try and do that. We can say, like, okay, well, here's our MRI scan, and here's structural difference, or an fMRI scan, or we can do EEG, and we can look at how the brain's physically acting at a millisecond level and say, well, there's something different about this. But I think part of the problem is that everybody's kidneys pretty much work the same, and nobody's brain realistically works the same way as each other from that, like, cellular level almost. Genetics causes the structures to arise slightly differently. The size of my amygdala is different from everybody else's, and there's still been, through some shape or form, the way that it connects to the rest of my brain is going to be different from everybody else. The way that the neurotransmitters are weighted and how I use them and so on are going to be different. And that's one of our big challenges in psychology. We constantly get critiqued that there's so much individual differences, there's so much variation that all of a sudden you can't track a lot of this stuff. And that then just starts to become part of that natural noise. And so the issue is when we look at something like schizophrenia, there isn't a place that schizophrenia arises in. There isn't a place that depression arises in. There isn't a place that, even if we look at things like dyscalculia or dyslexia, that we might go, dyslexia, that's reading, okay, that's going to be, left side Wernicke's area maybe. Not realistically. There are other places. There's potentially going to be some implication with the occipital lobe, being able to see the written text. but also like the production of that, there's going to be an implication of maybe the arcuate fasciculus, so that's where the Wernicke's area connects with Broca's area and being able to produce that written speech. And so there's going to be a much wider web of different activities occurring. And so I think that's part of a lot of that core problem, that there isn't a core place that ADHD arises in. And they are right by saying we can't point at somewhere and say that thing is wrong. That thing is too big or it's too small, that's ADHD. Yeah, absolutely. But there is no disorder, and even the ones that everybody recognizes as, well, yes, schizophrenia is obviously a thing, that's the exact same explanation, but nobody critiques that.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's this like double standard almost, that ADHD doesn't have a place you can point at. Well, neither does schizophrenia, but you're not complaining that schizophrenia isn't a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And like, yeah, those arguments then all of a sudden don't really line up. They don't start to make sense.
I think you're right. So I think this is something that I think we do talk about quite a lot when we're teaching this, and it is the idea that no disorder or no difference is, like you said, made up of one thing. They are what we call heterogeneous by nature. They have multiple risk factors, multiple protective factors, multiple manifestations, multiple phenotypic profiles of how they actually appear. Dyslexia is a really good example. So like my PhD was on dyslexia, and you were talking about different areas of the brain. I think when a lot of people talk about dyslexia, they think of it being very kind of, well, it's just difficulty with reading, but it's not, because one child with dyslexia who might be finding reading difficult may be finding reading difficult for a completely different reason to another child who's finding it difficult. And that complex sort of like myriad of sort of like underlying kind of etiology is going to be so different from child to child, and it's exactly the same in ADHD, it's exactly the same in autism. We tend to think of autism as being what we call like a spectrum disorder, very kind of heterogeneous, very sort of different in terms of the profiles that you see. But I've always argued that, to be honest, that's probably a way of thinking or a perspective that we probably should extend to other neurodevelopmental differences, because maybe they don't all necessarily exist on the same kind of spectrum, but they are all much more varied than we probably understand. And then when you move to like kind of more your area of expertise, which is more sort of like the neurological kind of stuff, you understand that therefore by logic, it's not going to look the same at that level either. And I think once you get comfortable with that ambiguity, you start to maybe understand this as a collection of challenges rather than it being something that we have a very specific answer to. I think if you try and find that specific answer, it will send you just a little bit mad yourself. Like I remember when I was doing my PhD, we are naturally inclined as researchers and as academics to try and get to the absolute ultimate bottom of things, like the absolute answer. And I just had to sort of let it go in the end. I was just like, I'm never going to come up with a complete profile, an underlying cognitive explanation for why a child has or does not have a comorbid profile of literacy and language difficulty, and therefore I'm just going to have to be comfortable with this idea of difference and ambiguity. But yeah.
You mentioned the idea of like how heterogeneous a lot of these tend to be, and like this always reminds me of something that an idea that I'd always held around depression, which is this idea that we've got like major depressive disorder, and it's quite like a blanket definition that's applied to lots of different people. And I've always held this view that there's different kinds of depression in that come from different neurological differences. So, there are discussions around, is it related to neurotransmitters? Is it related to connectivity between different areas? And for me, that's always been one of the greatest justifications in my mind for why treatments that work differently for different people in depression. We've got treatment resistant depression where nothing that we run seems to work, but that to me is more of an argument that, well, whatever the source of that depression is, it's more complex than what standard cases of depression might be. It was quite nice because a few years ago, I think it was fMRI research came out that went, oh yeah, we've tested loads of people with depression, we've pooled them together based off of similar characteristics, and we found that there are a bunch of different types of characteristic depression, and as far as I'm aware, I've not really seen any implementation of that evidence being used to like create different interventions or to target that, and I'm certain something will be being done. But this idea that if you test loads of different people, you will find that some of them will just have similarities and some of them will have differences that don't really cross over. And this is going back to like this idea of ADHD. There's 3 different types of ADHD.
Yeah, they didn't mention that, I don't think. Or did they?
No, they completely ignored.
I think they mentioned inattentive versus maybe hyperactive kind of symptomology, but they didn't say, according to blah 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 blah.
Yeah, I believe it was name dropped, but they didn't like mention what it was. They didn't explain the differences or anything. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. So I mean, to be honest, we've kind of got into this, and we've not really. Maybe we do need to take a little bit of a step back and sort of say, well, what do we actually mean by ADHD? So when we talk about ADHD, we are talking about a neurodevelopmental disorder, or I prefer to say neurodevelopmental difference. They mention this in the documentary, the idea of like the DSM. So you guys have probably heard of it, and we'll obviously cover it. If you are obviously studying with us or come study with us. So they fall into a category of neurodevelopmental disorders, which essentially are right at the start of the DSM. And the DSM is ordered in kind of like a lifespan trajectory. So we sort of start with those that typically would be recognised in childhood, but also have a very strong genetic basis and also familial kind of like risk. So they are in that category because essentially they have that genetic basis. And that's the thing that again really annoyed me about this show, is that they were kind of arguing that ADHD is potentially a social construct, but it's literally diagnostically grouped because it is not, and it's not. We have other disorders that impact sort of like behaviour, so things like impulse and control type disorders. So we might talk about this in another show, things like ODD, conduct disorder. They belong in a later category because the evidence for the genetic, even though there is evidence to suggest there is genetic components, it's just not as strong as those that fall into the neurodevelopmental disorders category. And I think partway through the show as well, they started trying to almost discredit the DSM as well. So there was that doctor, wasn't there? Literally being like, oh, this is ridiculous, that like, basically it's a list of arbitrary symptomology that we've grouped together and we've decided that it's a thing. And I sort of sat there thinking like, what construct do we have on earth that we've not sort of sat down and grouped together and decided is a thing? Like,
this goes back to the same like kidney failure. Well, the symptoms of kidney failure are socially arbitrary. Like the idea that I'm urinating blood is something that we go, that's bad. Mm-hmm. And then you have somebody
in that pile.
Yeah, and then you have somebody else that goes, this person has no ability to motivate themselves to get out of bed in the morning. Mm-hmm. Why is that different? And again, it comes back to this like arbitrary, these are the correct ones. Because we can see it, and these aren't correct because we can't see it. I don't know if it's worth getting into the DSM for people that aren't familiar. And this was one of my rants about it. They were obsessed with the DSM. So the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistics Manual. We're on version 5 TR, which is the theoretically revised version. Importantly, though, it's the American Psychiatric Association. Psychiatric. So there is an argument they made that I do fully agree with, which is the DSM was originally DSM-5, and there's a wonderful open letter that the British Psychology Society wrote to the APA. I love showing it to students, where they completely grilled the APA for creating DSM-5, and it's why we have the DSM-5 TRs with lots of complaints, is very medically focused. Because it's made by the psychiatrists, not by the psychologists.
And psychiatrists have a medical degree as well.
Yeah, their job is predominantly medication or like interventions that are more medically focused.
I think sometimes people don't understand that as well, because we have a lot of students that think it's possible to sort of do a psychology degree but become a psychiatrist. But yeah, just to be clear, like it's typically you would do a medical degree or a conversion medical, you can do like a thing, and then you specialise in psychiatry, so it's a different path.
Very medical focused. We have the ICD-11. We use the European standard, and this was one of the things that frustrated me, was the DSM says this, here's a list of the DSM rules, and I'm going, we don't use the DSM that much. Will a copy of the DSM exist in a British doctor's office? Yes. But is it the de facto tool that they use? No. It's another reference tool based off of the, again, like there are differences between the DSM and the ICD-11, but they made, and they mentioned this earlier, and then again, this comes back to there was a lot of things that they would say that were kind of like double standards, or almost like they weren't even really paying attention to what they were saying, because they mentioned how homosexuality used to be classified as mental illness. Right at the start, they're like, here are crazy things that used to be mental illness, and then on, maybe ADHD is something that we'd end up removing
I
from the book.
completely missed that, and I'm going to go back and look at that because that
It's
was
right at the start.
really annoyed me. But yeah,
And somebody's going to comment on it now. Be like, they never said that. But based on my memory, I recall them highlighting how like homosexuality used to be classified and then it was removed, and maybe ADHD will be the same. And the thing that always infuriated me was they would later go on and be like, and I've quoted, I've said this is a stupid argument. I called it stupid in my notes because I'm a child. But they keep saying the DSM keeps getting bigger and bigger. And this is the idea that they keep adding all of these disorders and all of this stuff, and that's bad. It keeps getting bigger. And I'm going, yeah, but then you made the point earlier that they're removing stuff like homosexuality. So it's getting bigger, but you've also acknowledged that they're removing a bunch of stuff. So what is it? But also ignoring the fact that the DSM also lists like a ton of statistics. Like when you read the DSM article for like depression or ADHD, it gives you loads of breakdowns around, okay, what's the male female split in terms of diagnosis, and what kind of age group should you be looking for? What's the like stereotypical diagnostic likelihood in those age groups? What kind of cultural differences do we see in them based off of whites versus Hispanic versus black? And all of these different spectrums of what you should consider when you're diagnosing that never existed beforehand. And it's like, yeah, the book's getting bigger, not because we're necessarily adding more disorders, but because we're defining these disorders with more specificity and more data. And it's becoming more medical. It's becoming more to the standard of medical criteria. And they're going, this is terrible. This book's getting bigger. And we're like, yeah, that's not a bad thing though. And that's not to validate or invalidate ADHD. It's just that we now have more detail. We now have more information to classify these criteria. And yeah, it just started to get really weird. They were complaining about some of the symptoms. I don't know if you picked up on him. He didn't like one of the scientists, the doctors that they interviewed, didn't like the use of squirming
yes,
as a symptom.
So I know that at one point, one of the doctors basically made the comment that they were all just typical normal childhood behaviours. Yeah. So what child can sit still and see, or what child blah blah blah. And again, that's something that we talk about. That again, when it comes to things like diagnosis is not an exact science. It's not. This is something I talk to my students about all the time. It's an observation of behaviours over time that if they are significantly impacting somebody's daily functioning and their mental well-being and whatever, or their access to education or whatever it is, at that point, then we might suggest that practitioners step in and we might label it. There are many children that will have a label. There are many children that have these challenges and difficulties that won't have a label. Some will receive support, some will not receive support. And at some point, yes, absolutely, you've got to understand that a lot of these behaviours are typical, because again, we've got to be careful not to suggest that behaviours within neurodiversity necessarily are typical and that we all have. It's a tricky argument to sort of say that we're all a little bit autistic or we're all a little bit ADHD. We don't want to go down that route. But to a certain extent, absolutely, we have behaviours that are developmentally appropriate, and we have to be careful that we're not basically suggesting that all children that squirm and do whatever meet the profile of ADHD, because of course they don't. They are literally at a point in their lives where they have underdeveloped frontal lobes, they can't repress those kind of behaviours, and they act in a certain way. But it's when it meets a certain threshold that's when it becomes problematic. So again, it's what she was saying wasn't incorrect, and that's something that we kind of discuss and debate, that yeah, absolutely, you have to think about whether or not these are just typical behaviours. Are they actually maybe in relation to a specific time point in this child's life, stress or whatever else they're experiencing, or is it something more fundamental and kind of like pervasive? So what she was saying wasn't incorrect, but it was just the way that it was put forward.
No.
Oh no, it's just typical kid stuff. Like,
Yeah, and I think it's like what you mentioned is this important. Like, yes, we acknowledge that these are subjective, but it's always to that point that we use these behaviours as diagnostic criteria with the explicit intent and label. That is when this starts to become problematic. And this is something I talk to students a lot around in like the first year mental health module, is that diagnostic labels are only useful if they're going to help somebody. If somebody has depression but they don't feel like it's getting in the way of their life, you can't force a label on them. It's not useful for that person to have that label if they don't need that. And this comes back to a lot of the discussion around like diagnosing things like ADHD and autism in adults, where they've now started to adjust and have coping mechanisms. And there's an argument around, should you diagnose somebody with something when they're an adult if they don't need to have that? There are absolutely adults that would benefit from having that diagnosis and getting help, but there are some that kind of cope with it and they're all right with it. And then you start to argue around, how consistent is that done? So yeah, this idea of like squirming is just this concept like, oh, it's such a everybody squirms. It's like, yeah, I'm very fidgety. I know that I'm very fidgety. I'm constantly playing with stuff and like touching my face or whatever. And I don't feel like that's problematic. And I would never go to a doctor going, yeah, sometimes I scratch my face and like play with my fingers and stuff. But when I get to the point where, and like a lot of the focus on ADHD is school, is education, and that's like that framework of you have to sit there and you have to do something. And as much as we can argue around is education and school a good allegory for employment and the workspace, we still have to recognise if you are in a setting, if you're working in an office and you're having to input data into spreadsheets or whatever, stereotypical classic office idea, if you're constantly squirming to the point that you can't sit still and do that job, that is a problem. If you're doing that in school, that is a problem. And that's when it's a symptom of ADHD. If you just sit there and you like to twizzle with your hair whilst you're doing something, that's not a problem. And therefore, we wouldn't use that as a symptom. And they seem to be treating it as this idea that like squirming is something that everybody does, therefore it's not a real thing. But it's that extreme level where anything can be. It's everybody drinks water. You need to drink water, but there's also a level where you can drink too much water that is literally deadly to you. And it's that point of where are you doing this thing too much? Exercising. There are people that don't exercise enough. There are people that exercise way too much to the point that it's unhealthy, and there's that middle balance. And they seem to be completely disregarding that and going with this idea that yes, these are subjective criteria, but if we had your child squirms 4 times an hour as an objective cut-off point, that then starts to become overly redundant to the point that, like, again, what that squirming is and how that manifests and like the specific instance of what that looks like is very important to defining what that behavior and that criteria is. And it's really disappointing that they just completely gloss over that. And again, like try and sell this as this like, oh, it's all just made up stuff and this book is all like, yes, it's psychiatrically oriented, but also again ignoring that they're treated. They oftentimes, I don't know if you spotted this, would mix up the people that they have, and you'd have some that are psychiatrists and medical doctors, and some that are psychologists, and they'd oftentimes conflate the two.
yeah, so I think we were talking about this earlier a bit. So it wasn't very clear necessarily who was who and what they do. So I think there was an ed psych from UCL, pretty sure. There was also some neuroscientists, some academics. There was also some GPs, but there was also some practitioners who they actually labelled as psychologists, but they weren't psychologists. And this annoyed me the most because I ended up going into a bit of like a Google hole of kind of like trying to find one of these particular women. And they billed her as being like a neurophysiological psychologist or something. And I was just like, well, first of all, what's a neurophysiological psychologist? Like, kind of, it's not, we have protected titles in psychology, and neuropsychology is a protected title, right? So
Not
9.
not neuropsychologist in terms of like a title, but something like a. It depends on the
There's a
context.
neuro one
If it's the like clinical neuro, then yes. So if you're going and diagnosing people that have like Parkinson's disease or strokes in like a hospital, then yes.
Then that's
But if
protected.
it's from like a research perspective, for example, kind of similar to educational. So like I can say that my background is in my PhD was in educational psychology, not as the title. I didn't do an MD. I didn't work in a school or anything like that. But it was psychology that was focused on education. So it's a bit like that.
Yes, I think they were kind of sort of trying to suggest that she fitted into this category. They called her a psychologist, but then she absolutely was not a psychologist. She didn't have a PhD, she didn't have a professional doctorate. I think at best maybe you could say that she was like some kind of therapist or some kind of like, I think we spoke earlier about maybe being like her practice was maybe a little bit aligned to like ABA type therapy and those kind of things. But I think that aside, because that just annoyed me anyway, because it kind of almost kind of gave sort of like credibility to her role and what she was doing. And I think when you see the title psychologist, you're like, oh, she must have studied it, she must have a qualification, therefore what she's saying must be kind of like viable. I think just those different types of roles, so GP versus ed side versus academic, they are all going to have ever so slightly different perspectives on this and slightly different takes, different experiences. And I think it would have been helpful to the viewer had it been made very clear that this was the view of the more medical community or this was the view of the research community or whatever. And I think all in all, the whole thing just wasn't objective. It clearly had a message that it was trying to sort of promote.
Concerningly, yeah, no, absolutely. So we were talking, we were talking about the different types of ADHD. So yeah, they didn't make it clear. I think they briefly named them. So you've got AD, the attention deficit, HD, which is that hyperactivity, and you've got the combined where it manifests in both ways. And I think one of the things that I disliked the most was the case study with the child, but also the main guy that was hosting it. So I know that there have been accusations of medical misconduct from him for the episode. So that was he used his knowledge of ADHD to get a diagnosis of it to acquire drugs. I'm not necessarily going to go down the line and say that he did do that. I would like to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he answered those questions honestly and it turned out to be ADHD. One of the issues is you can't validate that. That then starts to become really difficult to actually like test whether that's true or not. And he could say anything to his defense and you can't really deny that. So it's not worth getting into that argument.
No.
But his usage of them, he took the drug, he then went out to the shops and he was like, I just remember being like, this is such a you could say whatever you want moment. He said that somebody spoke to him at the shop and he just didn't respond to them. And he was like, I always go in and I'm always talking to everybody. And I'm going, number one, how do we test that? How do we validate that? You can say whatever you wanted. We already knew that this was a biased piece of media, and so it's difficult to verify whether he actually does that. And I would love for somebody that works in these shops that he apparently frequents to tell us, is he actually a really chatty guy or not? And if on that specific day he wasn't, because again, it's easy to cut out whether he was chatty or not. But also, and this was a prevailing, and it's very philosophical. This was in both his conduct and the case study with the child, that there was this pervasive use of the real self. And the real me would talk to people, and when I'm on the drug, I don't. The real child, the case study that they had, was always laughing and playing around. And when you give them the drugs, it suppressed that. And this, to me, felt very manipulative of how they approached this idea of the real you. And the case study with the child was very sneaky in how they presented it and very much validated that this was biased in how they were using it. So they took the child off the meds. We'll talk more about the case, I think. But just to summarize, they took him off the meds. And I actually had a note, and I was pausing it and I was writing my notes as I was going through it. And right towards the end, they were like, "Oh, he's having so much fun. He's himself again." And my note just went, yeah, but what about his school? I bet he's not doing good at school, is he? Because like this is where these symptoms are manifesting very critically. And this isn't me trying to pass shade on anybody because this is modern day life. But to me, I was going, right, you removed his video games, and I think that is a good thing. I play too much video games, I'm happy to admit that. But all of a sudden, they're showing us all these clips of them going out as a family and doing stuff in the park, which they weren't doing originally. And they're going, oh my God, look how good he is. And you're going, yeah, because now you're giving him an outlet. That's what's changed here. But they then eventually went, oh, his school's called, and he's being naughty, and he's not focusing on his work, and that's a problem. And then the mum goes, right, well, we've got to decide whether we put him back on it. And her conclusion was, no, because this is the real him. This is who he really is. And then the credits roll, and then afterwards they put him back on the medication a few weeks later. And immediately you're just like, number one, you hid that by sneaking it all the way at the end of this little text at the end, knowing that that validates everything that we've been talking about, which is this fact that ADHD manifests in a way that it is incompatible with modern day society. And this argument around schools not being geared for this is absolutely 100% true. And I do fully, wholeheartedly agree. Less sugar is probably a good thing anyway. Removing the TV time and the video games is going to be a good thing anyway. And schools should be better equipped for helping deal with children that have these difficulties. But the reality is, modern day society isn't, you can't go out and play in the park whenever you want. There are jobs that exist out there that are going to be really suitable for people that have ADHD, that have autism, and so on. That just the way that works. You know, I know people that have defined their jobs. I know somebody who they're a lecturer and they've got ADHD, and they were like, being a lecturer is fantastic because every day is different, and I meet people and I'm constantly talking about stuff. But I also get to like get embedded in my interests and the things that I like, and that's a career line that works for them. And there's other careers that don't work for people. And so I think one of the things that was really unfortunate was this idea that they suppressed this idea of this medication was genuinely helping this child to engage in education. As a modern day progressive society, education is really important, and there's something that oftentimes there's lots of debates around this, but I believe that as like a country that wants to be world leading, one of our biggest exports as a country should be science. It should be technology, and you don't get that without that education. And so you're denying this child the ability to have a future and being able to do that, so that he can have fun with his mates right now, because that's the true himself. And that then starts to become again like this very philosophical nature about what is the true you? Is the true you the disorder, or is the disorder manipulating that? Is somebody that has depression, is that person that can't get up in the morning and can't face difficulties in life? Is that the true them? Because ultimately that is a dysfunction that occurs in the brain, as ADHD is. And I don't think anybody in any right mind would say that somebody who is depressed is a reflection of their true self. That's somebody that needs help and support. And so again, it's this like double standard of how you can approach these, and this use of this like true self is very manipulative and problematic. What is a true self? Who is your true self? And does that medication cover that? Or does that bring out your true self? Is the true self that child that can do this work in his school and express his mind in that way? Is he having fun and messing around as much? No, he's not. And that is a reflection of yourself. But he was getting upset when he couldn't do that work anymore. And he went, I used to be able to do this. And so it's this like, again, what is that medication doing? Is that covering or revealing a true self? What is that? I don't know if you've got any.
Yeah, so I think it's tricky. So purely from, I mean, I don't mind talking about this because I talk about it to quite a lot of our students. So I take fluoxetine or Prozac, and I take it for a couple of different reasons. So one is anxiety because I have a panic disorder, but one is also because it generally also, so SSRIs also help with things like attention to a certain point. And I tend to find that, and again, because these things are not an exact science, whether or not it's my anxiety that sometimes can make me disorganized, or whether or not actually there are underlying elements maybe of ADHD because it does run in my family. Whatever it is, fluoxetine kind of like helps me just kind of keep myself a little bit more leveled and organized. And I often have this debate with my partner because he actually, and again, he wouldn't mind me talking about this, like he sometimes makes similar kind of comments where he kind of says that, to be honest, he sort of, this is going to sound really kind of like emotive, but he doesn't prefer me when I'm not on fluoxetine, but he does acknowledge that there's a difference. So when we first met, probably, I don't know, like over 10 years ago, I was on a lower dosage, and that was probably for many reasons, because at the time I was younger, I didn't have as many responsibilities, I was doing my PhD, didn't have kids, didn't have a full-time job, didn't have a mortgage, didn't have a house, any of those kind of things. And absolutely, my day was my own to a certain extent. So, like, you know, I had more money than I've ever had at any other point that's been free. We used to go out, we used to do things, whatever. And I think being on less fluoxetine, my personality probably was ever so slightly different. So it probably was a little bit more chaotic, a little bit more maybe extrovert, a little bit more, I don't know, just expressive maybe. I think sometimes the fluoxetine numbs me a little bit emotionally. It kind of sort of like raises those obviously kind of like serotonin levels and stuff, and it helps me with lots of different things, but it probably does mute me a little bit emotionally. I think maybe I'm a little bit more less emotionally perceptive when I'm on it. I pick up less on people's kind of, or at least it impacts me less. So I think one of the things that you tend to say is that I kind of notice less when he's upset, or even when I'm upset, I just sort of get on with things. Whereas if I wasn't on my fluoxetine as much, I would probably be more emotional myself. It was okay back then. Now my life has changed. I am a mom, I have a job, I have a mortgage, I have these different things, and my threshold of being, I suppose, able to cope with my anxiety and all those different things has obviously changed. I'm on a higher dosage of fluoxetine. Whether or not I'm now not my true self, or whether or not it's more that I don't know what my true self would look like off the, actually no, that's a lie, because not that long ago I did reduce my medication and it didn't go well. So the true self in this instance, if you want to call it that, isn't probably one that is particularly favourable, because the level of things I have to cope with when I'm kind of like have reduced my fluoxetine, it does kind of become sort of like overwhelming. So yeah, I do understand that people can see it in that argument, because my partner very much sees it in that way. But whether or not that is, yeah, a way that we should talk about it, I'm just really not sure. I do know that one thing that they did talk about in the documentary was this idea of kind of being on the medication at certain points in the year, but not at other points. And that is something that is quite common. So children with ADHD, quite often, they'll have breaks in the medication because it works for that kind of like short term, because sort of like amphetamines very much work in the moment, but they don't, not like fluoxetine. I don't, well, you might say I might be wrong. I don't think they have as long a like half life and those kind of things. Maybe it's things like fluoxetine. So
Yeah,
fluoxetine
it works straight away and
fluoxetine, yeah, lasts for a very long time. You can kind of like stop taking them and it's still in your system for a week or whatever afterwards. Even I think I've read somewhere that you can still feel the impacts for like months afterwards. Amphetamines aren't, they are much more short term, they get metabolized a lot quicker. Because of that, it's possible to take them when you need them, but then actually not take them at other times. And that's sometimes an approach that people do take. So when children are in the summer holidays, or when they break up certain points in the year, they'll stop taking them, and then they can kind of go back to, I don't want to say true self, because again, I don't want to kind of posit it as sort of like being true self or not true self, but they can just revert back to, I suppose, how they are when they're not on it, which is all that it is, I suppose. So you also have that argument as well, and certainly a video that I play my students, I have a video and it's about a guy who has ADHD, and he talks about the fact that he does feel different when he's on the meds versus when he's not on the meds. he can't do his schoolwork when he's not on the meds, and that really impacted him, so he had to take it at that time. But he does acknowledge that when he comes off them during periods of breaks or whatever, he gets on better socially with his friends and he prefers to be that person. So I don't think I really have an answer. I've kind of just spoken around that in a very kind of like vague way, but I don't know.
I think, but I think that's like, I think that's the argument then, because part of what I was kind of saying is this idea that like, what even is a true self? And there isn't necessarily like a default, this is the correct way to be, but there is this like oppressive default that the true self is being unmedicated and being like having fun. But like you said, when you're not medicated, you struggle to deal with all of the things that life throws at you. And that's part of that like life is very chaotic. Modern day society has us surrounded by cars driving down the road and noises going off and pollution, microplastics, hyper processed foods, all of this stuff that you can't really get away from, even if you could get away from it. Employment and what you need to do to get employment. You know, this idea that if we move away from like education with this idea that you're going to become like a scientist, if you're going to become like a plumber, for example, you know, there's a lot of discussion around like vocational work and becoming plumbers and electricians and so on, and that is highly valuable. But also, somebody with ADHD, how well are they going to be able to go in and learn to become a tradesman, to be able to go out and to be, a lot of tradespeople are independent and they have to run their own business. And if somebody's got ADHD to the level that they struggle to be able to organize, and that is a very common symptom, is difficulty with organizing and being able to like focus on tasks, you're going to struggle to run that business as well. And so oftentimes, like, oh well, you know, school doesn't always matter for everybody. And I will say, yeah, maybe it doesn't. There is a level to where we say like everybody should be educated to a baseline level to give them opportunities. But if they would rather become a tradesperson that doesn't need all of this, like, you know, chemistry and physics and whatever, and instead they want to learn how to do something practical with their hands, that is absolutely wonderful. But also, these disorders still influence that. It just tends to be ignored a lot of the time, and that again tends to be quite unfortunate. It feels like it's being missold a lot of the time that being in a vocational career means that you don't need all of these skills. It's like no, you do though. It's just that like it might look a little different, but they're still embedded in there. So it does feel quite sad that that's kind of the approach that this show took, was to kind of just cover all of that up. And yeah,
I think at one point as well, and this was some of the content that we were sort of like agreeing with, but they just kind of put it in just the way that they put it in context was just not, just misleading. They were kind of promoting a neurodiversity approach without sort of they never labelled it as a neurodiversity approach. So absolutely, we promote neurodiversity. We have a whole module on it and kind of like psychology with education. We absolutely think that the world does need to adapt and needs to change, and we need to champion careers where individuals who struggle with certain elements can flourish. For example, we know that lots of children with ADHD, dyslexia often go on to kind of like artistic, creative careers. When you literally look at, and I think that's another thing that they mentioned as well, which really annoyed both me and my partner, because he is very creative. So he does music, does audio production. Didn't at one point they kind of almost, I might be imagining this, they came up with a list of famous people that had different disorders, and they almost tried to sell it as it being something that was fashionable. Yeah, they were like, oh, it's fashionable to have ADHD, dyslexia, and maybe this is one of the reasons why we've seen a massive rise in it. It's all over social media. People want to get diagnosed. And both me and my partner sort of sat there and we went, no.
They'd Googled it, because you could see when you Google like list of famous people, it has a very specific way that it lists it. And they literally Googled like famous people with ADHD and gone, look, there's like 30 people listed here. And if I Google right now, list of famous people with glaucoma, I would get a similar list and could go, oh my god, look at all these people, this disease is fashionable. It's like, no, when you've got like 10,000 famous people, at least 10 or 20 of them will have any one given disease.
That's definitely true, but I think also we talk about the fact that in terms of kind of like sort of like skills, personality, all these kind of those creative careers, artistic, visual type careers, do tend to lend themselves quite often to neurodiversity. Some of our most famous artists, inspirational thinkers, creative scientists, philanthropists, business people, whatever, have neurodiverse profiles because you have to be able to maybe think in a certain way, think creatively, think visually, and these are what we kind of posit as being sort of like strengths related to ADHD. So absolutely, it doesn't surprise me that if you look at a group of creative people, that you're going to see a higher than maybe the above average expected prevalence in that group than you would do maybe in, I don't know, accountants or something. That I'm trying to think of a job that is basically all about sitting down and concentrating and not kind of
like a lawyer or something like that, reading through all these tomes of laws.
Yeah, you're going to get a higher, because we see this fluctuation within different populations. That's just human nature, and I think they were trying to use it as an argument, and they use it in completely the wrong way. But yeah, the neurodiversity thing really got me because they were basically saying we need to change education, we need to change the world, we need to make it more accepting for people so that they can just be themselves without having to kind of like be medicated or be whatever. And we kind of sat there and we were like, well, yeah, absolutely, that's definitely true. Like, we know the education system needs to change. We know that the world needs to be better adapted to suit people with neurodiversity and differences. That's not an argument against ADHD existing, though. That's just something that we know we need to change. And they just never named it as that. And it was almost insulting in a way because it kind of suggested that people who champion ADHD, believe in it, work in that field, support people with ADHD, don't want that. And absolutely, that is what we're arguing for. And these two things are not separate issues, but yeah.
Absolutely. I do have some notes about how they fearmongered the drug.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember, we pulled out this massive sheet of all the symptoms from the drug.
All the side effects, and I think I remember turning around at the time watching, going like, doesn't every drug have that many side effects?
Yeah. So I'll read out. This is my thoughts in a moment. I put absolutely ridiculous approach of the guy refusing that he had ADHD, but then giving him drugs. So he was saying he doesn't have it. Did the test that said he had it and was like, oh, I don't know about that. And then he took the drugs. So that's my. I've mentioned that there were claims that it was maybe medical misconduct. I'm certainly not going to claim that, but I'm saying it's ridiculous that he's saying he doesn't have it, but he's taking the drug anyway. Because in that instance, if you've got ADHD, one of the arguments behind what ADHD is a deficit in dopamine, alongside some other neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, and so on. But this drug increases that, and so the paradoxical thing with ADHD is the reason why they are stereotypically they're all over the place is because they can't focus that motivational system to pay attention to something. So they're constantly looking for stimulation in their environment, which looks quite like manic almost. And then when you give them a stimulant, they calm down, and that's why it looks paradoxical. Why are you stimulating them? They get less all over the place. And it's because they're now reaching a point that their brain is able to actually focus on a standard generic task, like sitting and doing your math work, and being able to like reward yourself with being able to do that, to motivate yourself to being able to do that. If he doesn't have ADHD, like he was like, oh yeah, didn't believe it, then the effect that he gets on the drug is not representative of the effect that somebody that has ADHD has. So either he has it, and the effect that he has is a good representation of being on the drug, or he doesn't have it, like he believes, and his effect isn't representative. So that logic did not make sense. But it says, it shows a huge piece of paper. It talks about it being a huge pile of side effects, which is rubbish. The drug he uses has 7. So I looked this up on the NHS's website. They have a list of the drug with the symptoms. There are currently 7 more common side effects, 10 less common side effects, and a list of 38 maybe side effects. So they're literally called incidents, not known.
I think they blurred that bit out as well. Did you notice it on the leaflet? They blurred certain bits out.
I didn't notice anything being blurred.
And
but
I think it was the prevalence of the different things, whether it was common, not common, because normally in the leaflets it will say 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000. I'm pretty sure they blurred that.
If that is the case, maybe we need to look back at that. But the incidence not known, importantly, is like we've given this drug to 1 million people, and like one person has said that their hair started to fall out. maybe it's related to this drug, but it could be related to literally anything. But legally, they have to list it. So that list of 38 things are like almost a legal security of when we've tested this across loads of people, at least one person has said that this had happened, but we've not been able to verify if it was because of this drug or because of something else. But legally, we just have to mention it. So realistically, the side effects are 10 less common and 7 more common. The side effects of these drugs are also pretty tame. A lot of the side effects are just like you might be a bit tired, you might feel a bit nauseous after taking it. That's something that you'd expect with ibuprofen or paracetamol. I had a look at the contraceptive pill because the contraceptive pill is always oh yeah, women just take it and yeah, whatever. The side effects of the contraceptive pill included blood clots and increased cancer risk. Mm-hmm. I'll name 2 side effects that the ADHD medication didn't list: blood clots and increased cancer risk. So there's no question around looking at these medications that people look at and go, oh yeah, people take that and that's fine. But because of the stigma associated with the ADHD, something like feeling a little nauseous is all of a sudden a really big problem in this list, when it's perfectly fine to expect a woman to go onto contraceptive medication, and it might increase the risk of cancer, and being like, okay, I'd rather feel nauseous than have that dramatically increased cancer risk. So he says that this list reinforces that we're playing around with the chemistry of the brain. I am going to not read this next line because it does include an expletive, but I said, yeah, so does paracetamol. Importantly, paracetamol changes the way that your brain processes the message of pain. So this whole playing around with the chemistry of the brain being this like super evil, like, oh my God, this drug is like cocaine, it plays with the brain. Again, it's like 25p for a box of paracetamol from Home Bargains. That is the exact same thing. It plays around with the way that my brain chemistry works. And then I also have this comment on him being chatty. Also, no, I didn't mention this earlier. We can't verify his chattiness, but he's also ignored the fact that he went into a supermarket with a camera crew, and so that is also going to have an impact on like how that social interaction plays out. And so, can you trust what he says? Yeah, fear mongering the side effects. If he doesn't have ADHD, then his experience of those drugs is completely null and irrelevant. So again, it's this paradoxical. It's almost like he's claiming both things are true at the same time. He either doesn't have ADHD, like he believes he doesn't, or he does have it, and his experience of the drug is genuine. And it's just like, pick your battle, pick your side. What do you actually believe in? But yeah, I also have a lot of notes about the case. Mm-hmm. I've seen lots of people complaining about the case with the child as being almost abusive or misjudged almost. My main concern from the get-go is that they're talking about they've been giving them these drugs and saying that like they've had to increase the dosage to keep these symptoms down. Okay, so that means that this drug is doing something, so that means that ADHD does have a biological basis. If they were giving them the drugs and they weren't doing anything, then we go, okay, then fine. They were saying that he was on 10 milligrams and went up to 20, then 30, then up to 40 milligrams. This might be they've edited something and not told us this context. And if they have, they really shouldn't have because it's concerning. But they've basically gone, yeah, we're just taking off the tablets tomorrow. And so what you should generally do with any kind of drug is lower the dosage, and then make them go cold turkey. And that's really concerning because that can result in, again, like there are side effects of things like seizures and so on that can occur from just ripping somebody off of medication. And that wasn't disclosed. I would like to believe that they tapered him off that medication, but the way that they presented it, I don't know if they actually did. They talk about being happier off the medication, but present zero evidence of it. They just say that he's happier because of it. Notably, one of the things that they expressed was how violent he was with his brother being off the medication, and then showed that when he got off the medication, he was getting violent again. So again, there's this aspect of they're taking off the drug because that's the true expression of himself, but the people around him are then being physically hurt because of that. And whilst I don't agree with the idea that you should be drugging somebody so that everybody else is safe, that is something that oftentimes got overlooked, which was the fact that this has a significant impact on the people around him. There was a lot of identity politics, so the idea of should he be low functioning and have fun or be able to function, this true self stuff. There wasn't a clear message, so some arguments that ADHD wasn't a real thing. Others were focusing on the medication being unnecessary in favour of behavioural interventions. And I do agree with this idea that behavioural interventions are oftentimes overlooked. But again, their approach was to discredit that ADHD was even a thing. They're talking about it being this whole myth and this social construct, and we're going, well, if it is a myth, then these behavioural interventions wouldn't do anything. And so again, there's that mixture of stuff that's going on. My argument around all of a sudden they're suddenly doing a lot of family activities and they're having a lot of fun and he's a lot more in control, and you're going, yeah, because you're now putting him in environments that are suitable for somebody that has ADHD, suitable for somebody that needs a lot of stimulation in their environment. And again, that disregard for what he was doing beforehand was probably just not the right situation, regardless of the whole ADHD argument.
I think it was quite clear as well that, and again, they don't really go into it and they don't really give context, and it's not for us to want more context necessarily, but I think, did you get the impression that they were in they were in like a small apartment, or so it looked like an apartment, so like kitchen, lounge, I don't know how many bedrooms kind of like coming off that, and then in terms of like the parents like relationship, it was like a single parent household with a partner. I think she was a working parent as well, so I think at one point you saw her sitting down on the laptop, and then inevitably the children were sort of like on the tablet, so you kind of get the impression that this is a household that's potentially got kind of challenges anyway in terms of like just being able to find the time, so that parent probably doesn't necessarily have the time to be able to take them out and do these things. So but they didn't really mention any of that. They were just like, oh, this is just a very average kind of situation. But actually, no, it's probably one that is strained anyway because of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a lot of that, like the context of what's going on. And I don't want to, for even a second, imply that like the parent was doing anything wrong.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
This is a modern day family that's trying to keep itself afloat in the best way that it can, but trying to use that as ammunition against the disorder from being legitimate is where we're drawing that problem of going, well, again, they've got this setup that they're drastically changing things that might not necessarily be sustainable. And as we saw at the end of it, it wasn't sustainable, and the child went back on the medication. And this, again, trying to use this to suggest that ADHD isn't real, when all of the signs are pointing to the fact that it was very much validating the existence of ADHD, but they were just trying not to focus on that, and they're trying to focus on the other arguments, was just very misleading. And it feels like the family were misled. Mm-hmm. It feels like they were an experiment when they shouldn't have been, and that they were potentially told something that wasn't like generally representative of maybe how things would play out or whatever. I truly don't know, but I have a bunch of research. Would you want to hear some research about the brain?
Always want to hear research about the brain.
So this is a bunch of studies that I've done out. I've got references with them and everything to back them up. But this is to generally refute a lot of the argument around ADHD in the brain. So I've got a meta-analysis here. So this consists of 29 voxel-based morphometry and 36 fMRI studies. So this is voxel-based morphometry is where you're creating voxels for cues, like Minecraft is voxel game. You're creating these building blocks of what the brain is built up like. The conclusion of this meta-analysis, with good amount of research, over 60 studies, is that ADHD patients demonstrate, or ADHD participants demonstrate significant alterations in activations across many areas. And as a quote, they said, patients with ADHD showed overactivation in the middle occipital gyrus, the right insula, the right precuneus cortex, the left cerebellum hemispheric lobule, the left fusiform gyrus compared to healthy controls. In contrast, the results also showed hypoactivation, so a reduction in activation, In the bilateral superior temporal gyrus, the left middle and inferior temporal gyrus, the left superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyrus, so basically the whole of the left side of the frontal lobe, the right precentral and postcentral gyrus, and the left insula and the corpus callosum. That's a lot. Mm-hmm. For anybody that doesn't know what those areas are, it doesn't matter. That's most of the brain. Mm-hmm. Like, ultimately, and they're going, yeah, these areas are either structurally different or are functionally different, and functionally generally here was underactivation of areas. For genetics, another study here says a wide range of genes that were associated to heredity of ADHD, with multiple twin studies showing up to 90% hereditability. So ADHD gene expression heat map revealed higher relative expression levels across several brain tissues for the following genes: ADRA2C, COMT, both dopamine receptor D1, D2, monoamine oxidase A and monoamine oxidase B, synaptosome associated protein 25, and tyrosine hydroxylase. You don't need to know what those are, but ultimately what we've got is evidence to suggest that we have multiple gene factors that are highly associated to ADHD. In EEG, so this is reading electrical activity of the brain, again, clear difference. So 4 EEG microstates were identified. So the coverage of salience network, which is state C. So salience network is paying attention to stuff. What is salience is what is like, what stands out to you as attention worthy. These were decreased in ADHD compared to healthy controls. The p-values of these studies are very low as well. So we'd be looking for a p-value of 5%. For this claim, the p-value was 0.146%. So like really, really low, which is good. While the duration and contribution of frontal parietal network were increased, so frontal being like executive function, control, paying attention to stuff, parietal network being more like spatial orientation. So frontoparietal network is being able to pay attention to your environment. So that being increased is quite indicative of the fact that they're constantly looking for something to engage them. The top discriminative features selected from support vector machine model with recursive feature elimination well replicated the above results, which achieved an accuracy of 72.7% and 73.8% separately in classifying ADHD in 2 subtypes. So the subtypes being inattention and hyperactivity, and then the combined one. So there's a lot of very technical stuff. Even I'm not familiar with support vector machine model with recursive feature elimination, but essentially they've been able to demonstrate this consistently across multiple different studies and multiple different cohorts. Looking at alternative stuff, so we've got conduct disorder, which is something that you're familiar with. So ADHD and conduct disorder both show differences in grey matter volume. So one of the arguments is maybe ADHD isn't a thing on its own, but ADHD might be linked to, might be a misinterpretation of something else. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to explain what conduct disorder is.
So conduct disorder, it falls into a slightly later category of the DSM, so the impulse and control type disorders. So naturally, you've already got something where you're talking about an inability to inhibit an impulse, which obviously is huge overlap with ADHD. Conduct disorder is slightly different in that it's where a child basically starts to violate social norms. So you tend to see it in slightly older children, but only simply because it becomes a point at which socially you might expect a child to be able to actually go out and enact these behaviours. So you wouldn't necessarily expect a 3, 4, 5-year-old child to be able to go out and graffiti, for example, but when they get to a certain age, pre-adolescence, for example, they might have more freedom to go out with friends. And conduct disorder is essentially where the behaviour starts to violate social or the personal norms of other people. So it can involve hitting, hurting other people, it can involve bullying, it can involve petty crime, it can involve graffiti, all those kind of things basically. Oppositional defiant disorder, so ODD, also falls into this category, and it's I always kind of describe it as almost kind of like that inability to sort of to regulate and repress those kind of like inner feelings. So maybe it's almost kind of like that inner child that, you know, gets really, really angry or really, really frustrated or whatever it is. It's that kind of almost sort of like bursting out and being able to kind of actually control it. So a child with ODD, again, they might hit, they are averse to things like authority, they don't tend to do what they're told necessarily. And again, these are the sorts of behaviours that you might expect to see in a young child or a toddler or whatever, but it's when it becomes the point where it's pervasive, it's all the time, and it becomes problematic. So yeah, but absolutely, you're right. ADHD often can be spoken about in context of these more behavioural type disorders, but actually they fit somewhere completely different diagnostically.
And we can see here as well. So this was looking at ADHD and conduct, and they said both ADHD symptoms and conduct disorder symptoms were related to similar and overlapping MRI findings of a smaller structure in the prefrontal and anterior cingulate cortex. However, our regions of interest approach indicated that that grey matter volume and surface area in the dorsolateral and dorsomedial prefrontal cortex and caudal anterior cingulate cortex were negatively associated to ADHD symptoms when controlling for conduct disorder symptoms, whilst rostral anterior cingulate cortex grey matter volume was negatively associated to conduct disorder symptoms when controlling for ADHD. So essentially, they found that these areas of the brain are associated with one but not the other disorder in both directions, depending on these two areas. So again, it's good, solid evidence to suggest that they're not the same thing, that they are distinctly different disorders, and that helps us to kind of categorize what ADHD is when we can point at areas of the brain that are not consistent or congruent across these. I do have a bunch of research looking at sugar and hyperactivity, because that was something they were like, get all the sugar out, and the kid was like, oh, it's all going to go off by the time we're done. So a lot of research disagrees with this. So sugar intake is increased in ADHD children, but the argument here is that this is linked to the dopamine levels in children with ADHD. So they say children with ADHD may ingest more sugar than other children in an attempt to correct the dopamine deficient state, resulting in excessive sugar intake that could result in sugar addiction and increase their risk for obesity. These children would manifest with slightly higher uric acid levels, reflecting the increased sugar intake. So they're saying that children with ADHD are more likely to become sugar addicted because they're almost self-medicating. Sugar increases that dopamine, that pleasure that you feel from like why we like sugar, and that's something that is missing in ADHD. A systematic review and meta-analysis said that sugar intake is related to ADHD, but this is not in isolation with other variables. So sugar was not associated with any symptoms of ADHD. So removing sugar from this child's diet, according to this research, arguably shouldn't have done anything behaviourally for that child. But it does link the two include things like gastric discomfort and reactive glycemia. So how excessive consumption of the sugar might result in, again, stomach cramps, and that might then manifest in behaviours that are difficult. There's a book chapter that I found as well, and I've just plucked this little quote out of them. They say trials have demonstrated that sugar does not impair attention, promote hyperactivity, or interfere with cognitive function in children who are normal and healthy. Those who are judged to be sugar sensitive by their parents, or even those diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So again, some research saying that sugar doesn't really seem to be, this idea that if you give your kids sugar and they become hyperactive, is quite old and outdated, and they seem to try to link that old outdated view with ADHD, and that's just some nice research that goes, no, there's no reason to believe that sugar intake would be doing anything to these kids. At most, if they are eating a lot of sugar, there are like health implications for having a lot of sugar, obviously. I didn't note this down, I did find one article that suggested that sugar intake wasn't related to body fat. I suppose that's maybe a wider index of diet in terms of like what else are you eating. But yeah, they were arguing that actually sugar intake wasn't necessarily an indicator of physical health, but there are things like diabetes and so on that we know that are oftentimes heavily indicated with it. So maybe a more complex discussion there. But yeah.
I think, because I mean, we do talk about sort of like dietary interventions for ADHD, like in the modules that we teach. And I think one of the things that we always have to conclude, and it's something that I say to my students, is that ultimately it's not it's not dietary, and it's not that diet is going to solve something for a child with ADHD, but that doesn't mean that improving diets for children won't also improve generally behaviours. It's the same with things like sleep, for example. But that's something that would be beneficial to all children. So things like gluten, for example, sometimes they suggest like reducing gluten, because gluten in of itself can cause things like brain fog and kind of like lethargy and kind of just all sorts of other things. But if you were to improve that generally for people, you might expect an increase in attention. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean that coincides a lot with that research that was going on. There's nothing special about sugar with ADHD. It's again a more broader general thing that affects everybody kind of equally in that regard. I do have some stuff on comorbidity. I don't. I think I've already gone quite a lot into a lot of research and statistics. Everybody's brains are frazzled at the moment. But ultimately, I think one of the important things is that um, the importance of recognizing ADHD. It's just some stats. So, with adults with ADHD, 90% of them suffer from lifetime mood swings, 4 to 5 times a day experiencing mood swings, and anger outbursts. Inattention problems include being easily distracted, difficulty finishing things, having no overview, poor planning. Hyperactive behaviors include things like talkativeness, difficulty sitting still, but things like underachievement in education, continuously changing jobs or positions because they get easily bored, having relationship problems because they struggle to stick to agreements, not taking enough responsibility, irritability or the need for variety and easily giving into things like infatuations, so like impulses within that moment. They're more prone for accidents, they're more prone for speeding violations.
I was about to say speeding was, yeah, that is
Yeah,
a fact.
higher rates of teenage pregnancies, earlier onset of alcohol and drug abuse. These are a lot of these, like, we oftentimes look at children with ADHD and go, oh, we need to do this because of education. But all of these things, there was one that factored into underachievement in education. All of these things are adult lifelong problems that if you don't help this in a child early on, that there are all of these risk factors. And some of these risk factors are associated to worse life outcomes, not being able to kind of go into a career that allows them to stick to it and build up that like experience and then get to higher positions in that. But also speeding violations, that's associated with car crashes, accidents, that's associated to lost life. And that's a really like we should be preserving, we should be protecting these people. Teenage pregnancies, alcohol and drug abuse are all associated. I've got one stat here that says that compared to a general population, there is a five-fold increase in the prevalence of ADHD in youth prison populations and a tenfold increase in adult prison populations. So, like, there are these really significant and damaging outcomes for people with ADHD if they're not fostered through a care system that helps them to find what works for them, whether that's medication or through behavioral intervention or whatever. And denying that this is a thing is setting up so many people for, again, these negative life outcomes that this approach from this episode is dismissing a lot of those people and is almost denying them the opportunity for the help that they should be getting and leading them to a fate of, oh well, it's the real them. If they end up in prison because of this, well, at least it's the real them. And we're going, well, no, because that person could be doing so much more with their lives. And there are there are arguments around. I'm currently preparing some materials, and one of the arguments around things like mindfulness as a counseling therapy practice is that it's very capitalistic in that it just tells you to just deal with the problem. You don't fix the problem. So when life gets you down because of capitalism and this idea of like you got to constantly be doing something productive for society and making money for businesses, whether you own it or it's one that you work for, it's very very political, and I'm certainly not going to get into that kind of argument because I don't even know how I feel about that. But this idea of like somebody with ADHD, should they be laughing around and having fun, or should they be preparing themselves for a future where they can contribute to society? There is very much an argument around should we be preparing people to just contribute to society? Well, no, but also like if you start to do really poorly in education, that's a lot of opportunities that close. And we see consistently across the board that good education is associated to better life outcomes, living longer, being healthy, having a healthier lifestyle with families, raising children, access to job opportunities that you wouldn't have access to, being able to move internationally for opportunities. And these are all things that people should have access to. We're not saying that somebody has to do this with their life, but to deny your child the opportunity to have that kind of future because you want them to have fun with their friends is very short sighted. And it's kind of that idea of like, oh, I could eat all this sugary food right now and I'll enjoy it right now, or I can pace it out and enjoy it in smaller bits in the future, but for longer. Is that like instant gratification versus prolonging that a lot of that argument in this episode seemed to come down to, and I suppose there's not necessarily an answer to it, but I don't know what your thought is.
I agree. I think it's, ultimately, we could completely give in to human nature, the self, whatever it is, and be all true versions of ourselves. But you could even think of it on that kind of very sort of like, I don't know. I mean, surely all of us curb our human nature every single day. To suggest that, Do you ever see Westworld? No. Like, I was talking about this the other day. Like, I'm pretty sure it was a book before it was a TV show. So it's about like Anthony Hopkins was in it, like only for like the first season, I think. Like, it's like a world that they create that's basically like full of robots, so people can kind of like go into this world and they can basically do whatever they want because it's a whole narrative like set in the Wild West and kind of like you can go in and you can treat these robots however you want to treat them. There are no moral kind of like boundaries, and I suppose you could argue that to a certain extent, like if because in this situation basically people just go in and the worst parts of human nature come out, right? This is a very weird like kind of analogy because I'm not saying this is what ADHD is like at all, but to a certain extent we learn to curb our human nature to fit into a social contract on many different levels. Like, we don't go out and just take what we want. We understand that we have to pay for things and people own it. We don't hurt people that we're cross out because we respect other people's boundaries and feelings and we don't want to do the wrong thing and all those kind of things. So to a certain extent we're kind of masking that anyway, and I think it is a bit of a sort of a logical argument to sort of say that we should all just be able to be completely whatever kind of like human nature is at its base level, because over time we have been socialized into a certain way of behaving. So our lives have become a social construct because we live within a social contract and a social society. And you're right, that requires things like education, it requires structure, it requires fitting into a certain kind of blueprint. Should that blueprint be more adaptive and promoting of things like neurodiversity? Absolutely. Should we be able to change the blueprint? Yes, but I don't think that we should remove the blueprint, because to do that is to basically have complete anarchy, and that's a completely different argument altogether. So, yeah, I think
modern day society is maybe not compatible with, well, I suppose with evolution, the way that our brains work. And I think this is why, again, one of the reasons why we see so many of these disorders arising more often. There's lots of arguments around diagnostic criteria getting better, accessibility to resources getting better, understanding and acceptance is getting better. But I think part of it as well is the state of the world and what's required. And there's lots of links between things like technology, mobile phones, social media, and so on, and mental health. I think those obviously have a lot of an impact. But what it boils down to is, are these going to disappear overnight? No. And so are we treating people for not being able to deal with modern day society when if we were living in like tribal nomadic societies, they'd be fine? We might have to say, yes, that is what we're doing. But is there a nomadic tribal society that this person can go back to where they flourish? No. But that's long gone. That's not going to happen, and society arguably won't let them do that. And so there is a degree to where we have to unfortunately say, yes, we are medicating people, we are treating people. Some of the symptoms and of various diagnostic criteria, where does depression come from? Where does anxiety come from? A lot of it comes from modern day society. So when we treat people for that, we're treating them for society.
You see higher rates in technologically advanced societies more so, but that's because of things like obviously better access to diagnosis and things like that too. But to a certain extent, it's because it's a product of our lifestyle.
So we have to a degree done it to ourselves, at least partially, but there's no going back. And so will we have to keep treating people because they've got depression because society's kept them down? Yes, because the alternative is to just abandon those people, and we're not abandoning those people. That's not what we're about. And so, is ADHD a social construct? Perhaps to a degree, part of it might be.
It's socially exasperated. That's what I concluded.
Yeah.
It's not socially constructive.
Yeah. I think that's a fairer way. A lot of ADHD symptoms are incompatible with modern day education, and that's why we're focusing on it. That's why we notice it. But at the end of the day, is the education system going to change? No. Should it change? Yes. But will it? No. There's not the resources to be able to make your education compatible for all of the different difficulties that children might face. It's Sisyphus is rolling a stone up the mountain forever. We're not going to be able to do that realistically, and there are obviously massive headways that we can make in improving that education, but I think there will always be a need to be able to diagnose these disorders, and there will always need to be some kind of treatment for those, just because life is what life is, and that's kind of one of the sucky things. It's horrible to think that there's only so much we can do to prevent this from happening to people, and at that point we then just need to do what we can to support them. And saying that it's not a real thing and that ADHD is a myth is failing a lot of people, because it devalues their experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we probably are going to have to.
We're going to have to. Yeah, we've
spoken a lot.
We've spoken a lot. I think everybody's brains are sizzling smush at the moment. I'm going to pack my research away. Be gone, research. I've had a little bit more that I was like, I'm just going to leave it there. But I think we've had a good complaint about it. We're not happy with the episode. We don't really agree with the message. There are things they've said that we've kind of gone, yes, but. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, because the credibility of Channel 4, I think, has been damaged. There are lots of people speaking out about this episode and how it misrepresents a lot of things, even the people that were on it. I know that if Channel 4 asked me if I wanted to be in a documentary in the future, I'll go, well, you did that to those people. So, if I did do it, I would have to be very conscientious about what I'm saying and what the message is. Because, I don't know how much I would be able to trust them from now on. Any lasting messages?
I don't think so. No, I think we've kind of covered it. I think it's just it's that final kind of it's what we said about the social kind of exasperation versus the social construct. I think it's just that you are going to see things manifest differently because society is different now to what it was 50, 60, 100 years ago. But yeah.
We'll see how it goes, I suppose. That's the future psychologist's job. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. We'll be back 2 weeks' time. I don't know what our next topic's going to be. We can see if something pops up, or maybe.
Yeah, what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks?
We'll see. Otherwise, I've got a couple of backup ideas for we could do, so we'll see how we get on. So thank you very much, everybody. Hope you enjoyed. Any comments? Obviously, as always, we do monitor the comments for a good few weeks after we post it. So, give us your thoughts, and we shall see you in 2 weeks' time.